Okay, so continuing here with Aquinas on natural law, question 94, we'll focus especially on Articles 3 and 4. So Article 3, whether all acts of virtue are prescribed by the natural law. So are all acts of virtue prescribed or commanded by the natural law? His answer is a little bit, I mean, it's maybe not quite as clear as it could be. I mean, it's clear enough, but he doesn't have a simple yes or no answer. But the basic simple answer is yes. I mean, he sort of qualifies it at the end of the responsio. But let's look at what he says in the responsio. He says, "For it has been stated that to the natural law belongs everything to which a man is inclined according to his nature." So it belongs to natural law, everything to which a man is inclined according to his nature. Now each thing is inclined naturally to an operation that is suitable to it according to its form. Thus fire is inclined to give heat. Wherefore, since the rational soul is the proper form of man, there is in every man a natural inclination to act according to reason, and this is to act according to virtue. Consequently, considered thus, all acts of virtue are prescribed by the natural law, since each one's reason naturally dictates to him to act virtuously. Then he goes on and he says, well, there are some things that are done virtually. Nature doesn't incline at first, but we won't get into that. The key point here, and of course, obviously, when the translation of the text here refers to man or men, obviously he's talking about human beings generally, not just males. So what it says here about natural law, again, it's interesting, helps to explain what Aquinas means by this. As he says, so everything to the natural law belongs everything to which a man is inclined according to his nature. So everything to which human beings are naturally inclined belongs to the natural law. He says a thing is since the rational soul is the proper form of man, there is in every man a natural inclination to act according to reason. So there's a natural inclination to act according to reason, and he says, and this is to act according to virtue. So to act according to reason is to act according to virtue. So he says, in that case, all acts of virtue are prescribed by the natural law, since each one's reason naturally dictates to him to act virtuously. So again, very, very clear here how important reason is for Aquinas in comprehending, understanding the natural law, and therefore acting virtuously. So in that way, he says all acts of virtue are prescribed by the natural law, since all acts of virtue are prescribed by reason. If we look at some of the objections and replies, there's some interesting stuff. Objection 1 basically says natural law concerns the common good, but some virtues are ordained to the private good of the individual, for instance, temperance. So the objector is saying not all acts of virtue would be prescribed by the natural law. Natural law concerns the common good. Some virtues, like temperance, are directed to the good of the individual, not to the common good. Aquinas' response is, well, it's both. I mean, temperance is indeed ordained to the natural common good. People being temperate, being moderate, that's obviously good for them as individuals, but it also is good for the community as a whole. So he says certain private virtues or things that may seem like private virtues, like temperance, are in fact also ordained to the natural common good, and therefore are part of natural law. Objection 3. Further, those things which are according to nature are common to all. So obviously simple enough. I mean, if something is natural, it's common to everyone. That's what natural means. But acts of virtue are not common to all, since a thing is virtuous in one and vicious in another. Therefore, not all acts of virtue are prescribed by the natural law. So an example of what the objector may mean, if you're relatively well off financially, and you take all of your friends out to dinner, that might be an act of generosity. It might be virtuous. You can see how that's an act of virtue. It's an act of generosity. If you have a family and money is tight, and your real responsibility is to provide for your family, to buy food for your children, your wife, and so on, and you take your kid, you take a bunch of friends out to dinner, that may not be virtuous anymore. It may in fact be an act of vanity. I mean, you shouldn't spend that. You should be spending that money on your family, not on taking friends out to dinner. So something that might be virtuous or a virtue in one situation for one person, depending on their circumstances, may in fact be not virtuous and in fact a vice for another. So an act of generosity for one person might be an act of vice, an act of pride, vanity, dishonesty in a way for another person. So the objector is saying, but then that means that the acts are not the same for all. The same act is virtuous for one person, vicious for another. Therefore, the objector is saying that not all acts of virtue are prescribed by the natural law, because if virtues change from one person to the next, then that can't be a matter of natural law. Aquinas basically replies and said that's dealing only with acts. That depends on various conditions, that some acts are virtuous as being, as he puts it, proportionate and becoming to them, while they are vicious for others as being out of proportion to them. So Aquinas says ultimately it is all brought under natural law. It's the changes in the condition of people that make one act virtuous, one act virtuous, one act vicious. But Aquinas says, basically what makes them virtuous in general is a matter of natural law. So what is virtuous for each person is shown to him or dictated by reason, and therefore natural law does, as he puts it, does prescribe all all acts of virtue. But what the objection 3 means there is something like that, and Aquinas replies and says, well, it's the acts themselves are particular to a situation, but natural law still natural law still prescribes all acts of virtue. So Article 4, whether the natural law is the same in all human beings and all men, the short answer is yes. So basically, obviously, the question here is, well, this is one of the issues that Aquinas will have to deal with when he talks about natural law, that anyone will have to talk about if they say that there are universal principles of right and wrong that are known to everybody. Then why does anyone act against those? Why do people not always act according to those principles of right and wrong? So that's sort of what Aquinas is sort of in the background here. Is natural law the same in all men? Does reason tell different people different things? Maybe is that why there's variation in the way that people actually behave? And basically Aquinas says, and we'll start with the responsio. He says, yes, the natural law is the same in all men, and basically he says speculative reason deals with necessary things. So speculative reason is dealing with principles, concepts, ideas, etc., that are mainly necessary. So for instance, that a triangle has 3 sides, that's a necessary truth. That the 3 angles of a triangle add up to 2 right angles, or 180 degrees, that's a necessary truth. It's not self-evident, but it's necessary in the sense that it doesn't change. So Aquinas says speculative reason deals with necessary things. Therefore, both the principles and the conclusions are the same for all men, even if not everyone knows the conclusions of speculative reason. So it's true for everyone that the 3 angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. Not everyone necessarily knows that, but it's true for them nonetheless. But he says practical reason deals with contingent things. Therefore, the general principles are the same for everyone, but the conclusions are not. So again, the example we just used, it's true for everyone that the 3 angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees, but it's not true for everyone that taking your friends out to dinner and paying for it is necessarily a virtue for you. For some people it may be a virtue, for some people it may not. The example that he uses here, he comes back to Socrates' example. Is it just to give your friend back weapons? Aquinas has a slightly different version of this. He says if the weapons are going to be used to attack your country, maybe it's wrong. We can just stick with Socrates' example. In general, it's right to give people back their property, but if it seems like they might harm, if it's reasonable to think that they might harm themselves with it, then it's not just. So Aquinas is saying that the conclusions are not the same for everybody. The general principles are the same for everyone, but the conclusions are not. The way that they apply in a particular case is not going to be universal. So speculative reason deals with necessary things, therefore the principles and the conclusions are the same for everybody, whether or not they know them. He says practical reason deals with contingent things, things that can change. One person's situation may be different from another person's, and because practical reason is dealing with these contingent things, whereas again speculative reason deals with necessary things, practical reason is dealing with these contingent things. Therefore, though the general principles, do good, avoid bad, don't murder, don't steal, etc., these general principles are the same for everyone, Aquinas says, but the conclusions will not always be the same. So again, there may be a case in which it's actually just not to return someone's property. There may be, many cases like that. The vast majority still may be, you give the property back, but there may be various situations in which it's actually just not to give the property back. So he says, the same thing may be right in one case, but wrong in another. And so he says, again, that that basically, again, natural law is the same for everyone, but again, because it deals with contingent things, certain conclusions may be different. And then in the 3rd paragraph, he says, and further, in some cases, the natural law, as he puts it, can fail in human beings. either because some kind of an obstacle or through a lack of knowledge that might be due to perversion or corrupt practices of some sort. Second paragraph of the Responsio, he basically says that, again, this idea that because practical reason deals with contingent things, the conclusions will not be the same for everybody. What is right for one person may not be right for another person. General principles are the same. Conclusions may not be. Again, that's what it means to deal with contingent things. But then even further, he'll then so there he explains that although the natural law is the same for everyone, not every application will be the same. Not every specific instance will the right thing be the same for everybody. Not every act will always be just or will always be according to natural law. And then in the third paragraph of the Responsio, he basically says, and then of course there are situations in which people act against the natural law, in which people act in ways that are unjust or wrong or evil. And why does that happen? So it's not just a question of contingency of people, of what the natural law commands changing in different circumstances, changing for different people according to their situation, but sometimes people act against the natural law. Why does that happen? So he says, third paragraph of the Responsio, consequently, we must say that the natural law as to general principles is the same for all, both as to rectitude and as to knowledge, so what is right and whether or not people know it is the same for all. But as to certain matters of detail, which are conclusions, as it were, of those general principles, it is the same for all in the majority of cases, both as to rectitude and as to knowledge, so both as to what's right and to whether or not people know what's right. And yet in some few cases it may fail, both as to rectitude by reason of certain obstacles, just as nature subject to generation and corruption fail in some few cases on account of some obstacles. So it's a little vague what he means there, but basically there might be some obstacle that stops people from doing the right thing, in which case natural law may fail. And as to knowledge, and so he says, in some cases people may not actually know what is according to natural law, since in some the reason is perverted by passion or evil habit. So maybe you're very angry and therefore you commit an act of revenge, which is against the natural law, but your reason has been perverted or clouded by strong passion, anger, a desire for revenge, or evil habit. Maybe there's a habit, something that you do routinely. Maybe you routinely drink too much, and therefore that, again, clouds your reason, makes you unable to reason properly, or an evil disposition of nature. Thus, formerly theft, although it is expressly contrary to the natural law, was not considered wrong among the Germans, as Julius Caesar relates. Caesar, of course, went to war against the Germans. We might take his comments about how the Germans were lawless and so on with a grain of salt. But basically, Aquinas is saying that there are times, for one reason or another, in which certain natural laws may not be considered wrong among certain groups of people. So he says there are cases, there are different reasons we can explain passion, evil habit, evil disposition of nature. He says there are ways to explain it, but it's true that not everybody actually acts according to law, according to natural law, in every single case in which they act. But he says, nevertheless, overall, natural law is the same for all people in the general principles. Sometimes it fails. There are particular situations in which the conclusions of these general principles might change from one situation to the next, but he says the general principles are the same for everyone. So let's look at the objections and replies. Objection 1 basically says the natural law, Objection 1 basically equates the natural law with the gospel, says not everyone accepts the gospels, therefore the natural law cannot be the same for everyone. Aquinas replies and says not everything in the gospel is contained in the natural law, since, as Aquinas puts it, they contain many things that are above nature. But he says, but all of natural law is contained in the gospel. So he says that there's stuff in the gospels that isn't simply natural law, but he says all of the natural law is contained in the gospel. But therefore, what he seems to be saying is the people who reject the gospel are rejecting the supernatural parts of it, not the natural law. Therefore, he says, that doesn't mean that the natural law is not the same for everyone. Objection 2, according to Aristotle, nothing is so universally just as not to be subject to change in some men. So objection 2 says, according to Aristotle, nothing is so universally just that there may not be exceptions or changes in some individuals. And again, Aquinas says Aristotle here is not referring to the general principles of the natural law, but to the specific conclusions drawn from them, or the secondary principles or precepts which may not apply to all men. So again, he says the general principles of natural law are the same for everybody. Specific conclusions may change from one person to the next. So always return property to someone from whom you've borrowed it. That is the sort of thing that is not so universally just that it admits of no exceptions or that it's always true. But the basic idea, not stealing, Aquinas would say that is always part of natural law. That's always the case. Whether or not a particular act of not returning something that you've borrowed, whether that particular act is stealing or not, that may change from one situation to the next. But the general principles, again, are the same. The third objection: further, as stated above, to the natural law belongs everything to which a man is inclined according to his nature. Now, different men are naturally inclined to different things, some to the desire of pleasures, other to the desire of honors, and other men to other things. Therefore, there is not one natural law for all. So this comes back to something we saw when Aquinas was discussing the will. The objector says different men are naturally inclined to different things. Some are more drawn to pleasure, some to honor, others to other things, others maybe to riches, others to all kinds of different things. Therefore, the objector says the natural law is not the same for all. People have different natures, and depending on the type of nature that they have, it may incline or direct them to different things, different goods, pleasures, honors, etc. Therefore, there is not one natural law for all. Aquinas replies by saying, as in man reason rules and commands the other powers, so all the natural inclinations belonging to the other powers must needs be directed according to reason. Wherefore it is universally right for all men that all their inclinations should be directed according to reason. So he replies and says, again, it's true that some people have a stronger inclination towards pleasure than others, some a stronger inclination or a stronger desire for honors, etc. But he says, in human beings, reason rules and commands all the other powers. So all the natural inclinations belonging to the other powers, as he puts it, need to be directed by reason, should be directed by reason. Therefore, he says, even if certain people are more drawn to certain types of goods than others, ultimately everyone has reason. Reason is the same for everyone, and reason should rule in everyone in the same way. Therefore, the natural law is the same in everybody, and therefore, he says, as he puts it at the end, it is universally right for all men that all their inclinations should be directed according to reason. So if one person has a strong pull towards pleasure, they still have reason. They can still reason about, is this actually a good thing to do? Should I do this? And that means that the natural law is the same for them. Their reason is the same. Therefore, natural law is the same for them. If someone is strongly drawn towards honor and wants to do something that's very ambitious and wants to do something that will bring them honor but is unjust, their reason can tell them, look, no matter how much you want this honorable position, no matter how much you want the pleasure that you would get from doing this thing, no matter how much you would want the wealth you would make by doing this, reason can tell you whether or not what you're doing is right or wrong, just or unjust. And therefore, Aquinas says that natural law is the same for everybody because reason is the same for everyone. It doesn't matter if your nature is slightly different and therefore you're more pulled in one direction or another. Reason is the same. Reason should always rule the other powers or the desires, you could say. Therefore, natural law is the same because reason is the same for everyone. And so that's sort of how he answers that. And again, basically says natural law is the same for everyone. Article 5, whether the natural law can be changed. We're not really going to focus on this, as you would expect. He says the first principles can really not be changed. He says a little bit about, in some ways, maybe the precepts of natural law can be added to in some ways. Basically, they can never be changed by subtraction. And again, the basic idea is the fundamental natural law, the fundamental first precepts of natural law cannot be changed. Okay, Article 6, whether the law of nature can be abolished from the heart of man. So again, natural law then, can it be abolished from the heart of man, basically from human nature? Can human beings come to somehow forget about natural law or lose contact with it? Can it be wiped out or abolished from human nature in some situations? And basically, Aquinas says the first general principle precepts cannot be. The first, most fundamental, most general, encompassing precepts of natural law cannot be wiped out or abolished from the heart of man, according to Aquinas. But he says some of the secondary precepts can be abolished or obscured in individual cases through sin. So as he says in the responsio, I answer that as stated above. There belong to the natural law, first, certain most general precepts that are known to all. And secondly, certain secondary and more detailed precepts, which are, as it were, conclusions following closely from first principles. As to those general principles, the natural law in the abstract can no wise be blotted out from men's hearts. So again, natural law in the abstract and its most general fundamental principles cannot be blotted out or abolished from people's hearts. Kind of poetic way of putting it, from human nature. But it is blotted out in the case of a particular action, insofar as reason is hindered from applying the general principle to a particular point of practice on account of concupiscence or some other passion as stated above. So he says, in the case of a particular action, the natural law can be blotted out. Reason can be hindered from applying the general principle, which is still known but not applied in this case because of concupiscence, desire for pleasure, some other passion. So he says, reason can be prevented from doing its work, but that doesn't mean that natural law has been abolished. It's just in a particular case, a particular action, reason has been hindered from applying the principles of natural law. But he says, but as to the other, i.e. the secondary precepts, the natural law can be blotted out from the human heart, either by evil persuasions, just as in speculative matters, errors occur in respect of necessary conclusions. So he says the secondary precepts can be blotted out either through evil persuasions, through people being kind of falsely persuaded about making a mistake and being persuaded of that mistake about the secondary precepts. So he says it's possible, it's an evil persuasion in the case of practical matters, but he says it's possible that people have errors just like they do in speculative matters, or by vicious customs and corrupt habits, as among some men theft and even unnatural vices, as the apostle states, were not esteemed sinful. So again, he says now, even more generally, sometimes vicious customs, corrupt habits can make people forget about what he calls the secondary precepts, the more detailed application of natural law. He says can be blotted out in some instances. So he says you will find maybe large groups of people who are simply not behaving to certain of the secondary precepts of natural law. He says that does happen. That is possible through customs, through habits, etc. If they're corrupt in some way, they can lead people to sort of forget about, or they can even kind of wipe out or abolish these secondary precepts of natural law. But he says the first, most fundamental, most important ones are always there. Maybe in particular cases they don't quite apply. They're not quite as efficacious or effective as one might hope. But he says overall the first, most general principles are always there. They're known to everyone. They're the same for everyone. And so that's sort of the rest of his discussion of natural law.